Jim watched Beth walk out, her hand tucked into Chad Monroe's arm, a borrowed smile plastered on her face. The low murmur of the bar went silent around him, a spotlight shining on his empty stool. Chad paused at the door, turning back just enough to offer a small, almost imperceptible nod, a claim staked. The door to the lakeside lounge swung shut, the sound a dull thud against the lingering beat of the jukebox. Jim Peterson stood by his table, a half-empty glass of amber liquid in his hand, feeling the weight of Beth's departure. She had walked out with Chad Monroe, her new constant, the man whose shadow had been growing longer in their lives for months. Debbie Miller, Beth's closest friend, had held the door for them, a small, knowing smile on her lips. It was a gesture Jim would not forget. He turned toward Debbie, who was now straightening a chair, her back to him. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed, casting a harsh glow on the worn carpet. "What the hell is wrong with you, Debbie?" Jim's voice was low, careful not to carry, but the edge in it was unmistakable. He set his glass down on the table, the ice clinking against the rim. "We talked about this. You told me you were on my side." Debbie flinched, turning slowly. Her eyes, usually quick and bright, darted away from his. "Jim, it's not that simple. Beth, she needs to figure things out." He cut her off, his gaze steady and unwavering. "No, you don't get to say that. Not after tonight. Don't you ever speak to me again, Debbie. Don't bother to even look my way." The words were not shouted, but they settled between them like frost. Debbie's face went pale, her mouth opening slightly, but no sound came out. Jim didn't wait for a response. He pushed past her, heading for the main exit. Earl, the bouncer, a man built like a grain silo, stepped into his path, his arms crossed over his chest. "Take it easy, Jim," Earl said, his voice a low rumble. "Don't cause any trouble." Jim stopped, looking up at the man. His jaw was tight. "How much is he paying you to intervene, Earl?" Jim asked, his voice a flat, dangerous monotone. "You'll need every penny to buy yourself a conscience." Earl's expression tightened, but he didn't move. Before Jim could push further, Susan Clark, her hair pulled back tightly in a sensible bun, grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly firm. "Jim, please, think about your kids," she pleaded, her voice a strained whisper. Jim turned his head, looking at Susan, then at the knot of concerned faces that had gathered around them. Gary Jensen, Cindy Jensen, and a few others from their usual Friday night crowd. "My kids," he repeated, a hollow laugh escaping him. "You mean like she did when she slipped out the back door with that Chad? Family? I don't have any anymore, Susan. Not tonight." Gary stepped forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. "Look, Jim, we know this is tough, but you don't want to do anything you'll regret." Jim's eyes swept over them, a challenge in his gaze. "Regret? I'm already past regret. You want to talk about it? Look me in the eye, Gary, and tell me what she did was acceptable. Cindy, Harry, she's seeing him again, ain't she?" Harry, usually boisterous, looked down at his shoes, confirming Jim's unspoken accusation. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with their discomfort. Jim pulled his arm free from Susan's grasp. He walked out of the lakeside lounge, leaving their murmurs and half-hearted protests behind him. The night air was cool, a sharp contrast to the heat that had built inside him. His truck started with a familiar grumble. He backed out of the parking space, ignoring the remaining faces in the doorway, and pulled onto the highway. The tires screeched as he accelerated, the sound a raw expression of the anger still simmering beneath his skin. The city lights blurred into streaks. The initial gut-wrenching urge for direct, violent retribution against Chad, against Beth, against the whole damn world began to recede, replaced by something colder, more calculating. He gripped the steering wheel, knuckles white. A fist fight, a scene, a shouted argument. Those were for the movies. That was Chad's game, the easy way out. Jim knew a different kind of fight, a long game, one that would hit harder than any punch, one that would dismantle the careful life Chad had built, piece by piece. His mind began to turn over possibilities, each one sharper than the last. He wouldn't just hurt Chad, he would make him disappear. He saw the familiar glow of the all-night diner ahead, a beacon on the dark stretch of road. He pulled into the lot, the gravel crunching under the tires. There was no going back from what was next. The Formica tabletop felt cool under Jim's fingertips. He sat in the worn booth at Patty's Diner, a fresh cup of coffee steaming in front of him, the sugar shaker and creamer dispenser glinting under the fluorescent lights. The gravity of his decision settled over him, not like a sudden shock, but like a deep, persistent ache. It was a cold, calculated path, one he knew he wouldn't regret. He knew Beth's life, not just the physical one, but the digital one too. Every account, every carefully curated post, every photo shared. A digital window he knew how to find. He pulled out his phone, the screen a stark white in the dim diner. It was almost 1 in the morning. He scrolled through his contacts, finding Annie Peterson's name. His niece, smart as a whip, barely out of high school, but with a mind for technology that had always astounded him. He pressed call. Unc? Annie's voice was crisp, clear, completely alert, despite the hour. Annie, it's Jim, he said, trying to keep his voice even. I need your help, tonight. Something urgent. I can pay you $500, cash. There was a beat of silence on the other end, then a quiet sigh. $500, Unc? That's quite the urgency. What are we talking about? It's about Beth and Chad. I'll explain when you get here. Can you be here in, say, 10 minutes? Got it, Unc. We'll be there in 7 minutes. Matt's with me. Just letting you know. She hung up before he could respond. Patty Green, the diner owner, a woman whose face held the wisdom of 1,000 late-night coffee refills, came over to his booth, refilling his cup without asking. Long night, Jim? Her voice was soft, laced with a familiar concern. He looked up at her, the desperation in his eyes probably more visible than he liked. Something like that, Patty. Look, my niece is coming, maybe a friend. We might need a little privacy. Would you mind closing up early? Patty looked at him, her gaze knowing, then glanced at the empty diner. Sure thing, Jim. No sense keeping the place open for crickets. Just lock up on your way out. She patted his shoulder, a small, comforting gesture. 7 minutes later, Annie's battered sedan pulled into the parking lot. She walked in with Matt Thompson, a quiet young man Jim recognized from some of Annie's photos. Jim was almost shocked by how put together Annie looked, even at this hour, her dark hair neatly tied back, a sensible jacket over a dark t-shirt. Matt, equally neat, carried a backpack. Sorry to drag you two out, Jim said, feeling awkward. Hope I didn't interrupt any plans. Annie waved a dismissive hand. Nah, Unc, just some late-night coding. Matt's always down for an adventure. She slid into the booth opposite him, Matt taking the seat beside her. So what's the deal with Aunt Beth and Chad? Jim took a deep breath, the bitter taste of stale coffee on his tongue. He started from the beginning, about seeing Beth and Chad at the lakeside lounge, about Debbie holding the door, about the empty stares of his so-called friends. He recounted the cold dismissal from Chad, the finality of it all. He didn't embellish, didn't use flowery language. He laid out the facts, raw and unvarnished. Annie and Matt listened, their expressions shifting from concern to quiet horror. When he finished describing the complicity of their friends, their jaws were practically on the floor. What kind of folks are these, Unc? Matt finally asked, his voice low. Beth's kind, Jim said, his gaze hard. Definitely not mine anymore. That's why I need you. I'm not going to punch Chad Monroe. That's a fool's errand. I'm going to make his life in Beth's a digital nightmare. I know she uses Facebook, Instagram, all of it. I need you to ruin their perfect little online world. He braced himself for them to call him crazy, to suggest therapy, to back away from the sheer audacity of it. Instead, Annie and Matt exchanged a quick, unreadable look. Then a wild, liberating laugh bubbled up from Annie, Matt joining in, a quieter, more amused sound. It wasn't mocking laughter. It was the sound of understanding, of shared defiance. Unc, you're a genius, Annie said, wiping a tear from her eye. This is so much better than a fistfight. She turned to Matt. Hey, you got the black box with you? Matt unzipped his backpack, pulling out a sleek, unmarked laptop, dark as midnight. Always, Annie. This, Unc, Annie explained, patting the laptop, is unregistered, untraceable. I built it myself, modified the operating system, everything. My little secret weapon. She flashed a grin. They wanted me for military intelligence, you know. Ivy League scholarships coming in left and right. But hacking for Uncle Jim? That's way more fun. She opened the laptop, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a practiced ease Jim couldn't even fathom. The screen filled with lines of code, then a familiar social media interface. All right, Annie murmured, her eyes fixed on the screen. Beth Peterson's Facebook. She's got all her privacy settings open like a barn door. Easy pickings. A moment later, a triumphant smirk spread across her face. I'm in. Let the chaos begin. Jim leaned over Annie's shoulder, the glow of the laptop screen illuminating their faces in the dim diner. Annie's fingers danced across the touchpad, scrolling through Beth's Facebook feed, then her Instagram, then whatever other platform she had linked. Matt sat silently beside Annie, occasionally pointing at something on the screen, a quiet co-conspirator. Jim watched Beth's curated life unfold before him. Smiling selfies, vacation photos, shared articles about mindful living. He knew most of these pictures, remembered the moments they were taken, the lies now echoing behind the smiles. Then a picture popped up that caught his eye. It was Debbie Miller, her arm around a man Jim didn't recognize. Who's that? Jim asked, pointing a finger at the screen. That guy with Debbie? Annie zoomed in. Doesn't look like her husband, she mused. Interesting. She made a mental note. And her other friends, Jim continued, his voice flat. Susan Clark, Gary Jensen, Cindy Jensen. They were all there tonight. All new. Within minutes, Annie had pulled up their profiles. Beth had a habit of tagging everyone, making it easy. Susan's cheerful family photos, Gary's proud posts about his construction business, Cindy's endless stream of perfectly plated meals and gardening triumphs. They were all laid bare, open for inspection. Annie grinned, a predatory gleam in her eyes. She pulled up Debbie's recent posts, showing Jim a specific picture. All right, Unc, she said, her voice barely a whisper. Are you ready? We can make this as disgusting as possible. No holds barred. Matt, who had been quiet up to this point, cleared his throat. He looked directly at Jim, his gaze earnest. You sure about this, Jim? I mean, once we start, there's no turning back. You're throwing a grenade right into the middle of your marriage. There won't be anything left. Jim didn't flinch. His eyes were cold, resolute. She threw the first one, Matt. She blew up our marriage the moment she walked out that door with Chad. There's no way in hell I could ever live with her again. Not after this. Not after seeing what I saw tonight. The words felt heavy, final. Okay, Annie said, a satisfied nod. Then let's make it count. We need a strategy. We hit Beth first, make sure it gets maximum exposure. Then we loop in Chad. And then, she paused, a wicked smile playing on her lips, we dismantle her little circle of friends. We need to make sure this goes viral. Every platform, every public forum. We need to use hashtags, tag local news, anything to get eyes on it. The goal is to expose the affair publicly, Matt clarified, looking at Jim. Not just for Beth and Chad, but for everyone who stood by and watched, especially Debbie Miller. Show her as an accomplice. Can we dig into their past? Jim asked, remembering Matt's earlier suggestion. Find out where they're vulnerable? Annie's eyes lit up. Always. Anything you know, Unc? Gary Jensen, Jim began, a slow, deliberate cadence to his words. His construction business. He's always cutting corners, known for shorting subcontractors, using cheap materials. Brags about it sometimes when he's had too much to drink. And Cindy, he continued, she's a gossip. Always has been. Pretends to be pious, but she's got a reputation for being loose herself back in the day. Before she married Gary, she was known to get around. And the details weren't pretty, but they were ammunition. Annie nodded, her fingers already flying. She opened multiple tabs, running searches, cross-referencing names, digging through public records. Got it. Consider their online lives an open book, Unc. She turned back to Beth's Facebook profile, her fingers hovering over the text box for a new post. All right, the first salvo. What do we want to say? Something to the point, something that leaves no doubt. She typed for a moment, then deleted it. Needs to be precise. A public announcement, something that shatters her narrative. Jim leaned closer, watching the words appear on the screen. Annie crafted it carefully, a masterpiece of public shaming. It detailed Beth's infidelity, not just with words, but implying dates, times, even specific locations drawn from Beth's own public check-ins. Then, as a final touch, she typed, "And with this, I announce the end of my marriage to Beth Peterson. May your future with Chad Monroe be as transparent as your past." She added a laughing emoji, then a broken heart. She typed in Chad Monroe's name, ensuring he would be tagged. With a final decisive click, the post was live. The first grenade had been thrown. The post on Beth's Facebook account exploded. It wasn't a slow burn, it was a prairie fire fanned by the late-night silence of the internet. Jim, Annie, and Matt watched the screen in grim fascination. The comment section refreshed every few seconds, new notifications popping up like digital fireworks. Strangers, acquaintances, even distant relatives all weighed in. Shock, outrage, pity, condemnation, it all flooded in, a digital torrent aimed squarely at Beth. Her phone, Jim imagined, was undoubtedly lighting up wherever she was, each buzz a tiny tremor shaking her world. Annie, her face lit by the screen's blue glow, worked with quiet efficiency. "Okay, that's Facebook. Now for Instagram." A few rapid clicks, and the same damning message, with the same tags and emojis, appeared on Beth's perfectly curated Instagram grid, disrupting the aesthetic of her life. Then Twitter. "She doesn't use it much, but every little bit helps," Annie muttered, and then any other platform she could link. Jim watched as Beth's digital life, once a shield of normalcy, became a megaphone for her shame. "Next up, Debbie Miller," Jim said, his voice quiet, almost detached. The cold satisfaction was starting to settle in, a low hum beneath the surface of his skin. "Any specifics you want to add, Unc?" Annie asked, already on Debbie's profile. To really drive home her enabling nature, Jim thought back to Debbie holding the door, her knowing smile. Just that she was there. She knew everything. She watched Beth walk out with Chad. She even helped. He paused. "And the picture you found earlier, the one with the other guy, can you make sure that gets a little attention too?" Annie's lips curved into a thin smile. "Consider it done." A second wave of posts went live, carefully crafted to implicate Debbie. They weren't as direct as Beth's, but they painted a clear picture of complicity, of a friend betraying trust. The comments on Debbie's pages began to mirror Beth's, a fresh blaze of outrage directed at the enabler. Jim pictured Debbie's face, pale and shocked, much as it had been at the lakeside lounge. Then the phones of Gary Jensen and Cindy Jensen began to buzz, not Jim's but Matt's and Annie's, and as mutual contacts, some still believing themselves friends, messaged them. The heat was spreading. Queries about Gary's business dealings, questions about Cindy's past reputation. The online world, once a casual forum, was becoming a public court. Matt, quiet but observant, had been digging deeper while Annie managed the front lines. "Unc," he said, turning the laptop slightly to show Jim, "I found some stuff on Gary, old business permits, complaints filed against him with the BBB a few years back. Nothing criminal, but it shows a pattern. Perfect for character assassination." "Leak it," Jim said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Anonymously. To the right places. Make sure it looks like it came from an angry, former employee. Cement their image as traitors." He wanted everyone who had stood by to feel the sting, to understand the consequences of their silence. Susan Clark, who had tried to appeal to Jim's compassion, was spared the direct hit. Jim decided that her attempt, however futile, deserved a slight reprieve. But she wouldn't escape entirely. By association, she would be tainted, caught in the digital fallout. The story was no longer confined to their small town's online circles. Chad Monroe's local celebrity status, a small-time hero in the community sports world, acted as kindling. Local news outlets, always hungry for scandal, began to pick up the story. Initial reports, discreet at first, mentioned unconfirmed social media reports regarding a local sports figure and a prominent community member. It was only a matter of time before they named names. Jim felt a cold satisfaction, a perverse kind of vindication. Yet there was a strange detachment to the whole digital spectacle he had orchestrated. It was happening, but it didn't feel real. It was pixels and words, not flesh and blood. Still, the outcome would be real enough. Annie, ever the strategist, was already setting up automated systems, bot accounts, and carefully chosen keywords to keep the story alive. ensuring maximum trending potential. "We need to keep this cycling, Unc," she explained. "Repetition, spread, keep it in their faces." "What's next?" Jim asked, watching the endless scroll of comments. "Next phase," Annie said, her eyes gleaming. "Anonymous tips, sports blogs, gossip columns. We hit them everywhere. We make sure Chad Monroe becomes synonymous with homewrecker and Beth with adulteress in every search engine. We turn their digital footprint into quicksand." The phone rang just as the first sliver of dawn broke through the diner windows. Jim answered, half expecting it to be Annie with another update. It was Beth. Her voice, usually composed, was ragged, a thin wire stretched to breaking. "Jim, what in God's name have you done?" Her words were a mix of fury and raw desperation, laced with the bitter tang of public humiliation. "What I had to do," Jim said, his voice steady, betraying none of the sleepless night he'd endured. "You've ruined my life," she shrieked, the volume rising, cracking with emotion. "Everywhere I look, it's there. People are calling me, texting me, my family." "You ruined your own life, Beth," he cut in, his voice calm but firm. "You dug your own grave. You threw the grenade, Beth. I just picked it up and made sure everyone saw what you did." He could hear her ragged breaths on the other end, the sound of her world crumbling. "I'll sue you, Jim. I swear to God I'll sue you for harassment, for cyberstalking. My lawyer is already on it. You can't just do this." Her threat hung in the air, a desperate, futile attempt at control. Meanwhile, Chad Monroe's agent had released a boilerplate denial to the press, a carefully worded statement about personal attacks and unfounded allegations. But the digital evidence was too overwhelming, too widespread. Chad was already facing immediate public backlash. Calls from his pro football team, Jim knew, would be less about personal support and more about damage control, about the integrity of the brand. Later that morning, as Jim finally pulled his truck into his driveway, his phone rang again. It was Debbie Miller, her voice thick with tears, almost unrecognizable. "Jim, please, you have to take them down, the posts. My boss called me. They're talking about letting me go. My job, Jim. Please." "You had your chance, Debbie," Jim said, his refusal curt and final. He remembered her smiling face at the club, her knowing complicity. "You made your choice that night. Now you live with it." He hung up, the sound of her broken sob lingering in the air. The official divorce papers were filed by noon, not by Beth's lawyer but by Jim's, a clear signal that this would be a bitter, public legal battle. Beth's lawyer, a sharp woman named Eleanor Vance, immediately painted Jim's social media campaign as malicious, using the posts as evidence of his unstable nature, his inability to cope, his desperate need for revenge. Jim's lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah Davies from a small Midwestern town not unlike their own, was already preparing her counter. She would not only present clear evidence of Beth's infidelity, but also highlight the moral failings that had led to it, the casual disregard for her family, her husband. The community was sharply divided. Some whispered their admiration for Jim's stand, a man scorned taking matters into his own hands, tired of being quietly wronged. Others condemned his methods, calling it cruel, unchristian, a digital lynching. There was no middle ground, a fun. Jim's phone buzzed with a call from his employer, the regional manager of the grain cooperative where he had worked for 15 years. He was called in for a meeting, a discussion about the negative publicity that could potentially affect the company's image. Jim knew what that meant. He might lose his job, but the thought no longer held the power to scare him. Annie and Matt, meanwhile, remained vigilant, monitoring the digital landscape. "They're trying to spin it, Unc," Annie reported, saying you're mentally unstable. "We need to be ready to counter every narrative shift." Jim nodded, watching his children play in the backyard through the kitchen window. The fight was far from over. The legal battle, especially the looming custody battle, would be brutal, but he would steel himself. He would protect his children from any further damage, from the fallout of their mother's choices. He would ensure their future wasn't tainted by Beth's past. Life's choices, especially costly ones, always unfold. Stick around to the end to see how these play out. The divorce proceedings intensified, morphing into a grinding legal battle where the children's custody became the central, agonizing battleground. Beth's legal team, led by Eleanor Vance, seized on Jim's public rage in his social media campaign, meticulously using every post, every comment, to paint him as an unstable, vengeful, and ultimately unfit parent. They argued that his actions demonstrated a profound lack of judgment, endangering the children's emotional well-being. Jim, through Sarah Davies, his quiet but formidable lawyer, methodically countered. Sarah presented evidence of Beth's affair, her consistent neglect of the children during her clandestine meetings, and the unsettling complicity of her friends, who had knowingly facilitated the deception. The facts were stark, laid bare in court filings and sworn affidavits. The children, caught in the middle of the storm, exhibited clear signs of stress. His son, 10-year-old Ethan, had started wetting the bed again. His daughter, 7-year-old Lily, had become withdrawn, her usual bright chatter replaced by quiet anxiety. Their pain tore at Jim's heart, a constant ache beneath his ribs. Sarah guided him through the unforgiving complexities of family court, advising caution and composure. No outbursts, Jim, she had warned. No showing emotion, no matter how much you want to. They'll use it against you. Out in the community, the repercussions were also taking hold. Gary Jensen and Cindy Jensen, facing their own professional and social repercussions from the leaks Annie and Matt had orchestrated, had openly distanced themselves from Beth. Their businesses were hurting, their social circles shrinking. Jim saw Gary at the grocery store one day. Gary had quickly looked away. Debbie Miller tried a different approach. She called Jim again, attempting a half-hearted, tearful apology. "I messed up, Jim. I truly did. I didn't know what to do." Jim's response was weary, devoid of anger, but final. "Too little, too late, Debbie. Ain't no going back now." He hung up before she could say more. Chad Monroe's once promising career had indeed taken a nosedive. Endorsements were revoked, his team had benched him indefinitely, and rumors of them considering dropping him entirely were rampant in the sports media. His public image was in tatters, a cautionary tale of a local hero falling from grace. Through it all, Jim dedicated himself to his children. He read them extra bedtime stories, helped with homework, and took them to the park, reassuring them of his unwavering love, trying to shield them from the adult ugliness that surrounded their lives. But it was impossible to completely protect them. He saw the pain reflected in their eyes, the confusion in their quiet questions. A hollow feeling began to replace the initial vindication. The satisfaction of striking back had faded, replaced by the heavy weight of consequence. He saw the cost of his revenge, not just in the legal bills and the whispers in the community, but in his children's strained smiles. Annie, perceptive as ever, noticed the shift in Jim. "Unc," she said during one of their late-night check-ins, "maybe we should scale back the public posts. The court might see it as continued malice. And for the kids." Jim paused, considering. He looked at the pictures of his children on his desk. "You're right, Annie," he said, a reluctant agreement. "Let's prioritize the kids and the legal fight. No more public spectacle." The digital war would cease, at least for now. The battle had moved into the sterile confines of the courtroom. In court, Beth delivered a dramatic, tearful plea, her voice trembling as she described the emotional abuse she'd suffered, attempting to gain sympathy and portray Jim as emotionally volatile, a danger to their children. She painted herself as the victim, caught in a husband's obsessive rage. When it was Jim's turn, he delivered a quiet but powerful statement. He spoke not of anger, but of shattered trust, of profound betrayal, and of a parent's sacred duty to protect their children, even from the choices of the other parent. He spoke of the values he wanted to instill in his kids, values of honesty and loyalty. His words, calm and measured, carried more weight than Beth's theatrical sobs. The judge listened impassively, then ordered thorough psychological evaluations for Jim, Beth, and most agonizingly for Jim, the children. The court wanted to understand the psychological landscape before making a final decision. The judge's pronouncement was firm, delivered without fanfare, yet its impact resonated like a gong through the silent courtroom. Primary physical custody of the children was granted to Jim Peterson. Beth Peterson would receive only supervised visitation, a stark testament to the court's view of her actions and her fitness as a primary parent. Beth sat motionless, utterly shattered, her face a mask of disbelief. Her reputation, her family life, everything she had taken for granted, was irrevocably damaged. Outside the courthouse, Jim heard the news about Chad Monroe almost immediately. His football career was officially over. The team had cut him, citing conduct detrimental to the organization. He became a cautionary tale, his name synonymous with hubris and infidelity, another casualty in the digital war Jim had waged. Jim felt a complex mix of vindication and profound exhaustion. The battle was won, yes, but at a staggering, deeply personal cost. The burning fury that had consumed him for months, driving him forward, slowly began to subside, leaving behind a quiet, aching hollowness. The fire was out, and all that remained was the ash. Annie and Matt, loyal to the end, helped Jim scrub his online presence. They secured his accounts, managed the residual public interest, and systematically removed any trace of the conflict from Jim's own digital footprint, creating a clean slate. He sold the house, the memories too sharp, too painful. He moved to a smaller, quieter town 2 counties over, hoping to provide his children with a fresh start, far away from the lingering shadow of the scandal that had enveloped their lives. He took a less demanding job, a step down from his previous position at the grain cooperative, but one that offered the flexibility needed for single parenthood. He picked up his kids from school every day, helped them with homework, and tried to rebuild a semblance of normal life. Beth, Jim heard through the grapevine, struggled to rebuild. Social ostracism was swift and brutal in their old town. Friends had evaporated, and her financial situation, without Jim's income or the support network she'd relied on, was precarious. A stark new reality had set in for her. Debbie Miller, too, had reportedly seen her social circle evaporate, her career suffering a significant blow from the public exposure of her complicity. Jim often reflected on the moral price everyone paid, himself included. The choices made, the revenge exacted, had left indelible marks on everyone involved. His children, though resilient, carried subtle scars. Ethan still asked questions about why mommy didn't live with them anymore, and Lily sometimes woke with nightmares. Jim tried his best to reassure them, but he knew some things could never be unseen, never truly unfelt. Recognizing the deep-seated anger and trauma that still simmered within him, Jim started counseling. He needed to process it all, to find a way to navigate this new life without the constant weight of resentment. One afternoon, months after the dust had settled, Jim was at the grocery store in his new town. He turned a corner and nearly bumped into Susan Clark. She looked older, smaller, her usually cheerful demeanor replaced by a weariness that mirrored his own. "Jim," she said, her voice soft, surprised. He nodded, a brief acknowledgement. I wanted to say I'm sorry," she offered, her eyes meeting his, "for not doing more, for being there that night and just letting it happen. It was wrong." It was a sincere, if belated, apology. Jim looked at her, then at his grocery cart. The moment passed in silence. He wasn't ready to say anything, to offer absolution, but the interaction left him pondering forgiveness, a concept he'd not yet been ready to embrace, but one that now, for the first time, felt like a distant possibility. Several years passed, marking a significant passage of time since the initial explosion of the affair and the subsequent digital fallout. The sharp edges of that memory had dulled, though they were still there, like old scars on a tree trunk. Jim had, against the odds, built a stable, quiet life for his children and himself in their new Midwestern town. The new house was smaller, the yard less grand, but it was home. His children were growing, tall and lean, showing remarkable resilience in the face of their tumultuous past. Ethan, now a teenager, played on the high school football team, his quiet intensity reminding Jim a little of himself. Lily, in middle school, had found her voice again, sketching intricate drawings and writing stories in her journal. They were good kids, and Jim saw the best parts of himself and, surprisingly, even Beth in them. Annie, now deep into her university studies, remained a loyal presence in Jim's life, a trusted confidant. She would visit during breaks, a whirlwind of intelligence and new ideas, always checking in on how Jim and the kids were doing. She rarely mentioned the past, But her quiet support was a constant. Beth, Jim heard, had indeed hit rock bottom. She'd lost nearly everything. But eventually she began a slow, arduous climb back, accepting a much humbler existence. She worked a modest job, lived in a small apartment, and focused her energy on her supervised visitations with the children. Then she reached out to Jim. Not for reunion, not for forgiveness, but for a profound, heartfelt apology for the pain she had caused. Jim, after much deliberation and discussions with his therapist, agreed to meet. The conversation was tense, civil, held in a neutral coffee shop. He listened as she spoke, her voice softer, her eyes holding a remorse he hadn't seen in years. He acknowledged her remorse, a quiet nod, but made it clear that the trust between them remained permanently shattered, a glass that could not be put back together. He reiterated that his tolerance for her presence in his life, and the children's, was solely for their well-being, for the fragile hope of co-parenting. Chad Monroe was a forgotten figure, his career long since ended, his name a cautionary tale rarely whispered, buried under years of new scandals and new heroes. Debbie Miller, the friend who had betrayed them, had vanished completely from their lives, a ghost of the past Jim rarely thought about. Jim frequently reflected on the nature of justice. Had his pursuit of revenge ultimately brought him true peace? The answer was complex. He came to understand that while he had inflicted pain, he had also reclaimed his dignity, a sense of self he'd thought lost forever. He had fiercely protected his children, drawing a line in the sand that needed to be drawn. The revenge had been a necessary, if painful, catharsis. Life, in its own slow way, moved forward. A new relationship slowly, cautiously, began to blossom for Jim. Her name was Clara, a kind woman he'd met at a local community event. It was built on honesty, mutual respect, and a measured pace, a stark contrast to the passionate, yet ultimately flawed, marriage he'd once known. There was no grand drama, just quiet companionship. His children met his new partner, observing them with a cautious acceptance. They were wary, as kids often are, but Jim could sense a quiet hope in their eyes, a glimpse of future stability. Jim realized that life's journey continued, not by erasing the past, but by learning to live with its indelible lessons. The weight of the betrayal still lingered, a faint echo in the quiet moments, a memory he sometimes revisited, but it no longer defined the man he had become. He was not just the wronged husband. He was a father, a survivor, and perhaps a man learning to hope again. Jim stood by the quiet lake, the last rays of a Midwestern sunset painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The water was calm, reflecting the vast expanse above. Further down the shore, his now older children, Ethan and Lily, laughed freely, skipping stones across the glassy surface. Ethan, nearly 18, carried himself with a quiet strength, while Lily, almost 15, had a vibrant energy that filled the air. They were good kids, thriving, despite everything. He reflected on the long, hard road he traveled, from the raw fury that consumed him in the lakeside lounge to this moment of quiet contentment. The digital storm he had orchestrated, a calculated act of vengeance, had been effective in its purpose. It had achieved what he set out to do, yet it left its own subtle, internal scars. He had learned the true meaning of paying the price, not just for Beth, who lost so much, but for everyone involved. For Debbie Miller, whose life had shrunk, for Chad Monroe, whose career was extinguished, and for himself in the slow, agonizing process of rebuilding. Morality, he now understood, wasn't about grand pronouncements or dramatic showdowns. It was about the quiet, daily choices, about the enduring fight for integrity in a world that often made it easy to compromise. He acknowledged the profound loyalty and friendship of Annie and Matt, who had not just helped him navigate the storm, but had stood by him unwavering when others had scattered. He still thought of Beth sometimes. The scorching anger that once burned him had long cooled into a resigned, almost distant acceptance. She was the mother of his children, a part of his past, but no longer the center of his world. His relationship with Clara had deepened, built on shared values and a profound earned trust that came from moving slowly, from being honest about past wounds. It was a quieter love, perhaps, but a more resilient one. His children, on the cusp of adulthood, were strong, kind individuals, a testament to his unwavering love and the life they had painstakingly built together. He carried the quiet wisdom gleaned from heartbreak and vengeance, a deep, abiding realism about human nature. The wide, open Midwestern landscape around him, with its vast horizons and sturdy trees, reflected his inner state, sometimes harsh, often beautiful, always resilient. He found a hard-won measure of peace, not the peace of forgetting, for that was impossible, but the peace of enduring, of having faced the storm and come out the other side. He understood that forgiveness didn't always mean erasing the past or a grand reconciliation with those who wronged you. Often it meant letting go of the need for vengeance, freeing yourself from the bitterness and choosing to live. While he had paid a significant price, Jim ultimately chose a path that allowed him and his children to move forward under the vast, unchanging Midwestern sky into a future he was finally ready to embrace.